All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Becca Jablonski. Let me just pull up my slides here. Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to come and spend some time with our neighbor state today. It's fun to be here and really just incredible that you have so many people in the room talking about this topic. So I was asked to talk about what do we know about the economic impacts broadly of local and regional food system initiatives. And I'll just tell you that, you know, this is kind of what we see, and this is from Julia's organization, American Farmland Trust, right? So we hear that if we spend some time developing local and regional food systems, that farmers win, and we hear your communities win. And so what I thought I would do today is really talk about what is the evidence we actually have to support these things. The other piece I wanted to mention, especially for those who were here last night, it was something I didn't think came up very much, which is that I think the key piece that communities have to do when they're thinking about implementing food policy councils or what the food policy council is actually going to do is what are the goals, right? Because I'm an economist, everything has trade-offs. And so, right, if we're maximizing farm profitability, it may be at the expense of other kinds of community outcomes. And so I think the first thing a community really needs to do is think about why are we doing this and what do we hope to achieve? And I will tell you, my opinion is that establishing local and regional food systems in and of themselves is not a goal, right? You establish local and regional food systems because you are trying to achieve a certain end. And I think that's really important for communities to keep in mind. So farm and ranch viability, what do we really know here? We have very clear evidence now at the national level that profitability increases with farm size. And I think that this is really one of the drivers for why we try to support local and regional food systems, is that there may be opportunities through these different kinds of, I'm going to say broadly, value-added activities, right, where we can actually get a higher per unit price. We heard about the willingness to pay, so we can get a higher per unit price for the products that we're producing, and that this may have benefits for particularly small, mid-scale, beginning farmers and ranchers that just can't compete on economies of scale, right? We have very clear evidence that along every segment of the supply chain, we have consolidation, and that creates challenges for small and mid-scale and beginning farmers and ranchers to enter the market, and that's really just kind of a fact. And we have clear evidence, as Debbie said, about this consumer willingness to pay a premium for these differentiated products. And when I talk about differentiated products, we can talk about local food, but I work a lot with Colorado wheat growers, for example. And so this can also mean something about, you know, developing snowmass, right? Some kind of variety where there's market so that producers can get a premium. So it's really everything along the scale of it's Debbie's Farms product, it's certified organic, it's grass-fed, it's natural, right? All of the sort of proliferation of labels and kinds of marketing strategies that producers are taking. From some work that we've done in Colorado, and this is actually something that's been funded by the USDA Ag Marketing Service in doing price reporting. So whoever has looked at the price reporting data for the USDA Ag Marketing Service produces, they've done this for a long time to make sure that producers have access to information, right, sort of universally across the country. Well, now they've actually started developing these products that support these alternative markets. And so in Colorado, I think there's 22 states that have participated in this, this type of price reporting information. And what we can see in Colorado is that there is no relationship between the prices, for example, that farmers or ranchers are getting for ground beef at a farmer's market and commodity prices. So that provides some evidence, right, that this is a risk management strategy. Now, that's not saying anything about the volume, right, that you can move through the markets at those prices, but at least if we're just looking at price comparisons, right? So this is where you can actually go to access this. And I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't know if Kansas has participated in this. I don't know if Debbie or Sam do you know? So we can look that up. Right, and so of course this is people have probably seen this food dollar price series that the USDA Economic Research Service produces, and so, you know, there's this concern that the farmers only get a small portion of that retail dollar. The challenge is that as we enter into those direct markets, right, we see that there's this willingness to pay, But there's likely a trade-off, right, that occurs between this pricing power and managerial control, and also the fact that if you go to direct markets, you are taking on substantial additional costs, right, mostly in the form of labor, which I'll show you the evidence of in a second here, but you're taking on all of these additional costs. And so when I go in and talk to producers who are selling at farmers markets, right, they're telling me they're doing it because they're getting the full retail dollar. They're often not tracking their expenses for that market channel. And this is not to say that these markets aren't profitable, and we'll go into evidence of that in a second, but it's something we really want to talk about and really evaluate this effectively. We think these intermediated markets are sort of a bridge, right? If you're selling to a school, for example, or for the products that are featured today, right, through KU, we can say that there's a middle person there, right? So you're probably not getting the same amount of that retail dollar you would have gotten if you sold at a farmer's market, but your transaction costs are probably less than if you actually had to sit at a farmer's market. You don't need to look at these numbers. I just kind of want to make sure that everyone's aware that they're here and kind of give you, because I think this is some very strong evidence that we see that if we look at the census information between 2007 and 2012, we can see actually that farmers and ranchers across all scales, including beginning farmers and ranchers that participated in local food market channels, were more likely to survive. So they were more likely to have a profitable business and be in business between 2007 and 2012 than farmers and ranchers that did not participate in these channels. However, they grew less across almost all scales other than the very smallest for local food participants in those channels. So just to say, it kind of presents competing evidence, right, about what the farm profitability impact is of these channels. So on the one hand, we have higher survivability rates, but we see smaller growth levels, right? Makes sense to everybody. So one of the things that we've been doing in Colorado, and we copied some very smart colleagues at Cornell, is to do these market channel assessments. So what we find in general is that producers who are selling through direct and intermediated markets do a really good job tracking sales by market channel, but they're not necessarily tracking expenses by market channel, and part of the reason is it's a pain, right? You know what you paid for X, Y, and Z, right? But you don't necessarily want to track it by market channel. But we actually think, and we have pretty strong evidence that it's important. And so this is just some of the preliminary results that we have from the work we've been doing in Colorado. I'm showing you the results for direct markets only. So if you look at the very left, what you're seeing is all of the direct markets. And then if you go across, you're seeing CSAs, farmers markets, and farm stands. So that yellow, that's the top 75th percentile, right? And the green is the lowest 25th percentile, and that orange is the median performance. And so what we can see from some of this data we've been collecting from producers is that for a channel like a CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, there's very little variability in performance. And if you think about it, I mean, there's a little bit of differences in the kinds of models you can do for CSAs, but they're relatively consistent. Versus farmers markets, we have very wide variability. And I can tell you, I do a lot of work with the New York City green markets, right? So it's the largest network of farmers markets in the country, I think actually in the world. They operate in all 5 boroughs of New York City, right? On a Saturday in October, they're getting 400,000 people who walk through the Union Square Farmers Market, right? That is a total anomaly. Producers there can actually make a living off of those farmers markets compared to some of our more rural markets, or I can tell you even our top markets in Colorado. And so what I think many producers do is they think, okay, we're just going to sell at the farmers markets that's closest to our house. But we see there's just tremendous variability in how these markets perform. And from all of the research we've been doing in New York, for example, we have commuter markets, right? So farmers markets that are located close to places of work. People may be purchasing very different kinds of products there and in different forms than they would in a farmer's market that's in more of a specific kind of neighborhood, right? And so we want to think about that. And I think this really helps us, and when we present this information back to producers, it helps them to think a little bit more critically about the kinds of markets that they're selling to and the fact that farmers markets are not created equal, and that's something we really want to think about when we promote farmers markets in our work. So we've done a lot of work out of CSU with some of the national data that's available, and we have these great fact sheets, or I think they're great, but maybe I'm biased. And it's on our website that we do with the USDA Ag Marketing Service called localfoodeconomics.com, and I can make sure you can figure out how to get there if that's useful. But this presents at least a national picture on what we know about the financial performance implications of these different kinds of market channels. The caveat being that for the national data, we cannot get to the level of specificity of actually breaking out within direct and intermediated channels. The data is just not good enough. And this is why we try to balance our work at Colorado State with both primary data collection, working directly with farmers and ranchers, which we often do through CSU Extension and with our food systems extension team that I actually co-lead, and then also some of the national information. So getting a little bit deeper into the national information, we use agricultural resource management survey data. I'm sorry, I won't go into much more details on the methodology and everything. You're stuck talking to an economist right now, and I apologize. But this is the best source of farm financial information that we have nationally. So it's a nationally representative survey, targets about 30,000 farms, and so we have really good information. Starting in about 2008, there were questions added to the survey specific about some of these local food marketing channels. So you can see here that we have a sample size of about 1,000 operations. Also a quick caveat, which is that this survey is congressionally mandated to support the core agricultural states. Kansas, I believe, is one of those. Colorado is not. So this information is much better in some states than in others. It does not generally correspond that the core ag states are also where most of the local food sales happen, with the exception of California, right? So that also creates some challenges. So what I want to draw your attention to here is thinking about some of the variable expenses, right? So these are the costs, the non-fixed costs associated with local and regional food system sales. And what I've done here is divided it by scale. The really interesting piece here that I think we've learned about from doing this work is that this is the opposite story of traditional agriculture. We see that as these farms and ranches that are selling through local market channels get larger, they're selling a relatively larger, or they're spending a relatively larger proportion of their expenditure on labor, right? So it's really the opposite story where we usually think about, right, trading labor for capital. This is the opposite story. Now, in these data, this would only include paid labor, so family labor wouldn't necessarily be included here. So maybe, you could say that some of the higher levels of labor are, that it's just going to be unpaid labor when you're at a small scale. If you're over $350,000 in gross cash farm income, that's not the story. So next, what we've done with some of these data is actually try to take the information we have and divide these producers by quartile. Because really what we're interested in is, what do these top performers look like, right? What are they doing differently to perform so well in these markets? And just so you know, in terms of how we're defining sort of success, we're doing it based on return on assets. Because we think that that's a good measure of sort of profitability, and it's cleaner in some ways, which I'm happy to go into if anyone has questions. So here what we do is, again, we divide return on assets by a scale and by quartile. So the blue bars are the lowest performing producers, the yellow are the top performing producers. You'll notice that you don't really see what's going on with that third quartile. That's because they're just about, at that break-even point there, right? So the return on assets, so that's why you can't really see it. I think what's notable here is that across every sales class, we see about 50% of these producers have positive return on assets, right? That is, you may think, wow, that doesn't sound very good. Let's look at what's going on in traditional agriculture, right? This is actually a pretty good story. Also, whereas you see for the sort of lowest performing quartile, right, for the smallest sales class, so under 75,000 in gross cash farm income, they look really bad, right? But we see that there are still about 50% of farmers and ranchers under 75,000 that have positive return on assets. I think this provides some evidence that even for some of these small-scale producers, that these market channels may actually work, right? And we want to dig more into what that top-performing quartile looks like. You'll also note that this level of return on assets is pretty impressive across these for the top performers. And here we do the same thing, but we divide it by market channel. And the sort of takeaway here, and this is what we see through all of the research we've done, is that on average, intermediated market channels perform better than direct markets. They just do. And so that's not to say that direct markets aren't important. You know, we think that they serve as important business incubators, and anecdotally, we hear a lot of stories. In fact, I was with a rancher in Colorado 2 days ago who told me he just went to his first market of the season. He sold $128 of ground beef mostly, and he said, but you know what? I sold 3/4. Right? So he was psyched because he developed some of those larger markets or those customers through the farmers markets, and those sort of indirect sales wouldn't necessarily be captured here. So I'm going to move on and talk now about what do we know about what the economic impact is, broadly speaking, for communities. So fundamentally, local and regional food systems are about rural-urban linkages. Even though we see increasingly that cities have policies that they're going to feed themselves, right? This is from the Denver mayor has said 25% of institutional procurement is going to be from Colorado grown, raised, processed sources. Given our numbers of farms in Denver, it's very unlikely that this is going to come from farmers in Denver, right? So this is really a strategy about rural-urban linkages, and I think we need to do that more. And I know it's hard sometimes when we have these food policy councils that are based in a county to think outside of our county, but it is fundamental that we do that. I think we're really limiting ourselves otherwise. So one is using the same data that I mentioned before. We can actually see that wage rates, average wage rates, are really pretty high for local and regional producers, right? You can see that we're looking at $26 if you're in a metro area, 23 and metro adjacent, and 21 in non-metro. The other interesting thing here is we know that our rural communities, many of them are struggling, right? And partially the story is that we see there's higher wage rates in urban places. We do not see any significant differences in wage rates across local and regional food systems for those in urban versus rural places. So that, I think, is also a good story about the potential for these rural-urban linkages around these food system efforts to support rural communities and economies. There have actually been a proliferation in the last decade of these economic impact assessments. I've done many of them. What we see in general, is that there are sort of these short-term positive but small economic impacts that occur from these systems, right? But we see that they're relatively small. And so I know, especially I used to work in a county for extension as an agricultural economic development specialist, and we see, we know that our municipal officials want to hear about what is the multiplier impact. And so we can give you a multiplier, and in fact our toolkit does some work in showing people how to do that. And I think that that's part of the story, but there's these other pieces that I think are actually probably more profound parts of the story about supporting opportunities for that next generation, about creating opportunities for small and mid-scale farmers and ranchers, and then also thinking not just about what is the farm level economic impact, but what are the impacts of putting in a new small-scale meat processing facility, or taking that existing custom exempt small-scale meat processing facility and getting them USDA inspected, right? Those may be the more important things. So I just wanted to mention a few words of caution in thinking about economic impacts, right? Is that resources are finite. And so if we're going to have more fruit and vegetable production, or we're going to have more local beef production, right, you don't have just extra land sitting around in Kansas, right? So you're taking it out of something, and whatever you're taking it out of, that already is having an economic impact in your community, right? It has some positive economic impact. And so we need to think about what is the negative impact of that, as well as what is the positive impact of this new piece. And it can be, thinking about the opportunity cost or countervailing effects. These can be on the supply side or demand side. This is a study that USDA AMS did now several years ago, right? But this looks at competition for vendors at farmers markets. If you develop a new farmers market in one of these red zones where there's already a high level of competition, right, you're probably taking vendors out of an existing market and putting them in a new market. Does that really have much economic impact? Probably not, right? It's probably pretty negligible. In fact, you may be causing more harm because now both of those markets may not be viable because they don't have the requisite number of vendors. And this is my note I mentioned about arable land. This is a study we did in upstate New York a few years ago, looking at the economic impact of food hubs, right? So we said, and I'm assuming everybody here knows what a food hub is. Is that No. So a food hub is a local food aggregation and distribution business. So they don't necessarily have to be exclusively local food, but for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that we have consolidation in every segment of the supply chain, what's happening is it's harder for small and mid-scale producers to get access to distribution and certain kinds of markets. And so these are businesses that have been subsidized by the USDA, particularly to support small and mid-scale farmers and ranchers and get them better access to markets. So we worked with this one food hub to figure out what the economic impact was in upstate New York. And we actually went and did surveys with their customers and said, are you purchasing less from other local distributors because of the availability of the food hub? And the answer, yes, right? And so when we actually did the economic impact assessment, we had to subtract that value of lost purchases from the value of additional purchases, right? And those are really important things to keep in mind. And I just sort of wanted to end with here that there's other economic impacts beyond the kind of multipliers that are really important to think about, right? So we have evidence that businesses near farmers markets have higher sales on market days. Someone made that excellent point that there was concern here about when the co-op started hosting CSAs, that they were going to lose, the co-op was going to lose sales when the CSA pickups occur. We do not see evidence. And I don't think Debbie mentioned this, but I think where the tension actually lies is we know about 50% of our household purchases for food are food at home purchases versus 50% food away from home purchases. And I think it's actually that we probably see a loss of purchases for food away from home when we create new opportunities for food at home, right? When people are going to do more cooking at home, but there may be health and other kinds of benefits from that. And that, you know, we have evidence that farmers markets, right, serve as business incubators, and that's probably an important service. And those are a little bit harder to quantify. We can still quantify them, but those business incubator services wouldn't be captured in a multiplier effect, right, which is a short-term static analysis. We see that that there's knowledge that's exchanged at these markets, and that these producers, right, these entrepreneurs are gaining business skills and experience through selling at these markets. And in fact, from the Green Markets Project that I just mentioned, we actually can show that not just do farmers get new ideas about products at these markets from interaction with a customer, and not only do they actually do stuff with those new ideas, right, they create new value-added products or they get other ideas, but they actually share them with other producers in rural communities. And so we can see that there's this sort of ripple effect of this knowledge sharing, which I think is really important for rural economic development. And I promise my last thing here, because I know I'm out of time, but I just wanted to tell you that one of the things we're doing in Colorado, and I think there would be opportunity to do some kind of replication here, or maybe we can do some sharing since we are neighbors, is that we're really looking at how urban food policies, programs, and initiatives can support farmers, ranchers, rural communities, and economies. We just completed a statewide plan. I facilitate the Governor's Food Policy Council as part of my position in Colorado, and the Denver Mayor's Office did a plan at the same time. We've worked really closely with them to make sure that Denver isn't just looking at Denver, and Denver realizes we have 80% of our population that lives on the Front Range of Colorado. That creates opportunities for the rest of our state, but we need to have conversations, right, with all scales and commodities of agriculture and supply chain businesses to make sure that our urban policies are reflective of the realities of agriculture and the way supply chains work. And I think through this project, we've been able to bring lots of different players together, right, large and small, to do this, right? So we actually have funding from, like, Colorado Wheat, for example, as we're working with our local food policy councils. And this takes a lot of effort and time to actually make these relationships work. But I think if we actually want to see food systems that are going to support our communities and economies across urban and rural areas, that this is the kind of dialogue that needs to take place. And so I will end there because I know I'm already out of time, but I would be happy to chat about this more. And I am leading an afternoon session if people want to get more into the data, which is always super fun. No one's going to come now, right?